Somatic Business Podcast. We're back again. The new special guest. We've been trying to arrange this conversation for about half a year. Well, we've tried for a while and now we've picked up again. Yeah, Rob, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
Um, I'll share a little bit of context of how I know you briefly, and then I would love for you to share more about what is it that you've been up to in recent times, and uh, yeah, I think we'll grab onto some threads from there. So I met Rob 6, 7 years ago, something like that, at a Contact Improvisation Festival. It was 2017, so 7 years ago. Um, it was in the Canary Islands. It was a very intense, interesting experience for me. I broke my arm on my first Contact Improvisation Festival, and it opened up a lot of doors for me, just that world. And yeah, I met you there, and actually already on the way there by car, you and your partner back then. And I remember it was like this, for me, this holy shit, we have so many common interests moment. Because I remember we were talking about nonviolent communication, um, and just in the flow of the conversation, just like one shared interest after another popped up. And then I was really impressed and also intimidated by how I saw you present in that festival and how you interacted with people and how you led yourself through that space, because it's a very intense, potentially messy experience at your Contact Festival. It was like 10 days. Um, and yeah, we stayed in touch. And then a couple of months later, I hired you as a coach. And you supported me in my process, actually, at the pretty much the beginnings of my entrepreneurial journey. And since then, we've been working together on and off on various topics. So first it was mostly entrepreneurship, sales, and then the last years it was more in the direction of like deep somatic work, like this like very subtle, uh, attuned nervous system work, for lack of better words. And one theme that's also been really present in our um, containers was sexuality, and yeah, I've learned a lot from you in that regards. I'm sure there's still a lot more to learn there. Um, but yeah, that's the long story long how I know you. And it's a good transition into what you've been up to recently. So if you want to share what that is, what you've been most passionate about and what you've been working on and working towards in recent months and years.
Yeah, man. Cool. I'm happy to be here, David. I remember, first I'll say, I remember when we were on Fuerteventura back in the day that I have this vivid memory of you like running down these sand dunes and going into the freezing cold water in the middle of like 40, 50 mile an hour wind gusts.
Mm.
And I was on the dune, like at a distance, looking down at you, kind of like doing some sort of like movement dance thing in the wind after getting out of the cold water and being like, ah, that guy. Yeah, it was cool. Vivid memory. That's good. Yeah, we've had many different contexts and forms and topics in our relating and channels over the years, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what am I doing? What have I been doing? I can go into the kind of more kind of myopic or detailed thing in right at what I'm doing right now, like actually right now in these days and weeks is building out a body of work that has been largely kind of oral for the past couple years into something that is potentially more scalable in terms of how the work can impact people and the business that can be created around it, essentially. So there's a lot of like jargon that I could say about exactly what I'm doing, but it is related to like architecting information management, basically, of taking these teaching topics and expanding them into what is effective curriculum for people of different backgrounds and learning styles and levels of experience with different subjects from conscious sexuality, tantra, neo-tantra, Taoist inner alchemy stuff to the somatics, nervous system awareness, trauma informed people stuff,
Mhm.
and more kind of full on in the esoteric mysticism side of things too. So taking a lot of these teachings also for sure extends beyond this into stuff about conscious relating and communication to create um, ways that people can learn about sex, basically. And I think it's in a way impossible to teach that subject in the way that I want to and support people in exploring it without the stuff that I just mentioned, that
Mhm.
like going into subtle energetics and alchemical principles and practices and deep uh, body-based work from Hatha yoga, Kundalini Tantra, Qigong, and more contemporary stuff like the Feldenkrais, Alexander Technique people, and all that stuff. It feels very uh, um, inseparable in the way that I experience it, and at least in the language that I'm trying to find to be able to reliably support people in finding their way. One of the intentions that I hold in that particular kind of arena is to support people in becoming autonomous. That the goal is, in a way, to help people to be pioneers of their own
Mhm.
discoveries. It's not just to be like, hey, here's what I figured out, but it's also here's how I figured it out, and here's how you can discover what's out there for you.
Mhm.
So, yeah, there's a this very kind of tactical, labor intensive, collaborative process of taking these teaching topics and all of the stuff that has emergently come up as I've been sharing with people and coaching people and doing my own kind of writing and conversational explorations around these subjects into um, just teaching tools, basically, really
Mhm.
cool teaching tools.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's the main thing that I've been doing for the past many, many months is working with folks and building out this body of work in a way to have a uh, like it the opportunities for asynchronous learning and also to just have more consolidated and refined teaching materials for the emergent work that I do with people and with groups. It's
Mhm.
really, really helpful for the depth and like breadth that we can get into if I'm using materials that people can basically familiarize themselves with and that we can use to kind of interface with these experiences or the possibility of experiences so that we have
Yeah.
shared vocabulary and shared lexicon to be able to move more, that it's really helpful to have shared reality there. So
Yeah. This is really cool. I'll just jump in there for a moment because I think that's something that can be really useful for entrepreneurs listening to embrace is what I'm hearing in what you're saying is, or the way that I'm translating it is um, becoming clear on what is the most effective way that you can use your time that you have live with people, and
mm,
then starting to think about, okay, what is the infrastructure around that that makes the live time as effective as possible?
for sure.
And yeah, I think that's the if we talk about scaling your business, that's the thing that you have to understand really clearly is like, okay, like what can only happen with me being live with a group or with a person, and what is everything around it that I can facilitate, maybe even potentially like train other people, but also just create material that people can go through at their own time.
Mhm. For sure. And with that, there's also a question around what is like expectable human behavior.
Hmm.
Theoretically, we all are, you know, can put on our self-leadership and self-accountability pants, but in reality, that doesn't really happen, especially at scale. So
Yeah,
thinking about like the values of asynchronous versus synchronous learning environments, and there's a lot of incredible work in the like educational design space of yeah, basically like what works and what doesn't, and what is the right kind of percentage and like pedagogical ideation and development and curriculum development and design and learning environment design, user
yeah,
of, because it's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I could just like tell people, but if they don't have a structure or an environment that supports them and really integrating it, that the transformational value of what is otherwise profound material is lower. So, it's not just like, can I present this information in multimedia, like text, audio, video, but what sort of environment will facilitate actual change for people, like lasting change, like they're different.
yeah,
And I do think that there's a lot. I've seen this time and time again where someone will just hear something or see something that they've never heard or seen before, and they're different, and it lands, and you can tell that there's a real shift. And it seems like that's not the most reliable thing to count on in
yeah,
terms of like like the psychedelic experience is interesting, and there's like more
yeah.
conversation about this. It's like, yeah, we can have these profound experiences, and we can certainly have them through transmission, like body-based transmission and energetic transmission. And if there's not opportunities for integration and reflection and interaction and putting it into practice in real time or very shortly after, that it does seem like the transformational value is really impacted. So
Yeah.
me being like, I'm coming out of 10 years of working with people one-on-one, and most of that time in durational containers where I'm like with somebody for a long time, usually for many, many months. So there's so
Mm,
much opportunity for ongoing
mhm,
support and integration
mhm,
and one-on-one attention and things like accountability and follow-up and all that sort of stuff. So being able to um, take not only what is different from just the many, many levels of like, this is in many cases material that's being presented rather than is solely emergent from just being present with somebody's needs and requests and what just feels inspired in the shared space, to creating learning environments that are architected. Um, yeah, it's been a lot of learning for me for sure. Sometimes
mhm,
going too much on the side of structure, and
mhm,
other times too much on the side of emergence, and finding
mm,
integration of like, we're really here to just set the field and be together as we journey through this material and the intentions related to why we're here. With there's just like a bunch of stuff that we pretty certainly should cover given the intention
yeah.
of, and how can it all just be accommodated and dialed in there with a lot of flexibility, but
Mm,
also a lot of sturdiness and consistency. So
mhm,
I've never done anything like this before, and it's been a full-on journey. We were doing something at very, very early stages, I think a year and a half ago, together with a group of guys that you helped
mhm,
gather around Europe. And yeah, that was the early days of me taking what had previously just been entirely like an oral tradition into something that was more presentation based and like a one-to-many container, so to say.
yeah. Nice. Yeah, I have two things that come up when we talk about this. One is um, one of the things that I'm kind of skeptical about in um, I'll take people who call themselves something like manifestation coaches or something like this, like kind of spiritual guides of some sorts, as an example for this, where my sense is that like they have a transmission and then they invite people into their field and people have like really powerful experiences, but there's very little support in integrating it. So then once they leave that field, there's very little left. And you can almost like, you can be worse off because you're like, fuck, I know what's possible. But I was not given the support in translating that or making a certain percentage of that experience like my default. So there's no like lasting impact. That's one thing. And another thing that I've um, taken to heart from one of my business mentors and I share with my clients frequently is whenever we create containers that include personal transformation of our clients, even if, like in my case, there's also focus on business. But of course, like if you're looking holistically at something, then you always need to have like some sort of personal change in that as well. That you there's a risk of supporting certain patterns in your clients of being like of mm, not being self-led. Like if you spoon feed them everything, and if you sort of like take care of things too much, and they start relying on you, and uh, it can support this sort of learned helplessness pattern where I'm like, something is not working, but instead of like being like, okay, what can I do? I'm like, David, please help me. So I think that's a really interesting consideration when opening containers for people is in your attempt to be really helpful, you can
Totally.
actually uh, strengthen a pattern in people which is not supportive. Which,
And in yourself, right?
yeah, totally.
Yeah. Cool. Well said. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
I can relate to this one too. It's a
mm,
big, especially given the work that I do and the way that I get so intimately involved with people. Um, it's just a part of my nature and composition is the way that I relate to people as a service provider or I don't know, facilitator or whatever, is
mm,
like very intimately with people. You know, I see a
yeah.
lot of folks. They're somehow like at a di more of a distance, and that's just not my style. That's not
Mhm,
that I really like make contact with people.
mhm,
And I think that there's something about that and the nature of the work and how broad my interests are that it really sets the stage for something like a cult. Like, it's
mhm,
like, yeah, people need support and they need community, and there's deep intimacy and opportunities for transference and all kinds of stuff that come with that. And what you were saying, one way that I could translate it is it's like hero, villain, victim.
yeah, exactly.
Like, you're the hero until you do something I don't like, and then the perpetrator, like I think that that's the normal in like therapy and development space is like the therapist or the coach is the hero and the client is the victim
Yeah,
uh, until the coach does something the client doesn't like, and then they're the perpetrator.
which certainly has never happened in our relationship.
No, definitely not. And yeah, I think this is an interesting thing to hedge against. And
Mm,
it's part of why in the containers, what we focus on pretty early on is responsibility.
mhm,
That like due to like the depth of the work and just in general, I think that we could all, maybe not all, but most of us could really use some additional kind of tune-ups around the depth of responsibility and empowerment and intentional creativity on like a
mm,
kind of cosmic level,
yeah,
that it's so important. So there's a tremendous amount of this sort of stuff. And it's interesting because when I really look at like if I'm singularly seeking to help people have as good of sex lives as I possibly can support them, we have to cover all of this other stuff. Like
yeah.
it's possible. And at the same time, it's fun because it's an opportunity to have very meaningful and deep conversations with people that would maybe never sign up for that thing explicitly, that they're just there because, they like pussy or whatever, like that's the that's the premise of the point of entry. So there is a little bit of the sell people what they want, give them what they need premise, while also wanting to make sure that I have people in the programs that are coachable and come in with beginner's mind and are really willing to accept feedback and to be coachable. It's a it's an interesting balance and very much kind of going into the trenches or the mainstream more than I ever have with this work.
Mm,
There's folks who have very deep spiritual practice, and there's also people who they don't know about any of this stuff. Like they may on some intuitive level have a lot more than they're aware of, but the language at least is something that they don't have. And being in environments where there's different ways of relating and exploring and getting support and just being seen and expressed and all of that are quite new. So yeah,
mm,
been really beautiful so far.
mm,
It feels very, very right on many
mm,
to have both like some of the most legit and advanced um, teachings around sexual mysticism and like the intricacies and subtleties of sexual experience with stuff that's foundational and just like basic sex education.
mm.
And um, yeah, there are many, many directions that I could go there in talking about the work itself. And I'm aware that this podcast has a slightly different intention, which I'm curious about how that can be maybe more deliberately engaged with or explored. I do
I
have,
mean, go ahead.
yeah, I do have some ideas, like some um, mm, potentially significant things that maybe people have heard before, but maybe would be a different angle or entirely new to get into stuff related to the, I could say broadly though, like premise of human experience and consciousness and the way that we are kind of engaging with thoughts and identity and
Mm,
conception of ourselves and what experience
mm,
and what the way that we form a sense of who we are and what has meaning and what is
yeah.
true is in a way from my experience. I think this may be, person to person here, but from my experience, the arena or context of sex and like intimate body-based exploration with other people is one of the most legible contexts for exploring like the mysteries of being or the reality of self and consciousness.
Mm,
And I think part of why I've been drawn to it personally and eventually professionally is because is it just affords so much opportunity, so much opportunity, not only for meaning and pleasure and connection, but also for um, meeting needs and connecting to opportunities on many different levels.
mm. Yeah,
And
we can go in that direction. I think that's I can say that one thing that I found um intriguing about meeting you and interacting with you is because I do remember that the topic of masculinity or like what does it mean to be a man, that was quite present in our coaching also early on. And I'm just remembering that I think one thing that I appreciated about you was there were certain qualities that I associate with being manly, I guess. Um,
is it because I have the hairdo of like one of the little girls in Whoville from right now?
well, that's the second part. I'll count to that. So, um, I think just observing you being very intentional about like where to focus, like yeah, being masterful in where to focus your attention and like who do I want to interact with. So sort of like being very um like directing your own energy very clearly. And that was something that it just stood out. Like I was in at this festival and it seemed like most people were just running around as headless chickens, kind of like just
There's like 150 people there, and
yeah,
everybody's sexy and in their bodies, and it's very chaotic. And yeah,
exactly. And overwhelmed and so on. And yeah, it seemed to me like you were guiding yourself somehow differently. So there was something, and I associated that somehow with something around like masculine qualities. And then at the same time, it felt to me like you were not identified, or let's say as identified as other people around how that had to look or show up and sort of like constrained into a certain
I'm
self-image.
conscious right now. I'm very spiritual and evolved, and I'm a good community member.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I'm a man, and that means I'm this and not that. And I think that this ties really powerfully into the realm of sex, where I think we so intimately meet our own ideas of what does it mean for me as a man to show up intimately with a sexual intimate partner, and like what is true about that, or like where can I actually step into certain whatever like archetypal things, and it's really powerful and it feels true, and where is it just a performance?
it's awesome. Well, thank you, first of all, for that
Hmm.
reflection feedback. Appreciate it. And also, amazing that you have such good memory from 7 years ago. Uh, yeah, cool. I guess I'll take in these compliments or reflections or whatever, and maybe start to unpack some of them. Yeah, there's so many things. There's so many directions that we could go with what you share. One thing that comes in that we can just kind of, maybe bookmark or tap and see if it grows is talking about pickup, because I think that there is a lot of information that I have um, training in, experience in, practice in that I would say like singularly comes from pickup artists, which is certainly a rough and tumble and a bit sketchy domain of personal development related information, like self-empowerment and, social empowerment type of information that, of course, has an underbelly and a dark side and some grime, some grime in there for sure. And at the same time, I've found it to be one of the most pure domains of aliveness and intentionality and freedom and empowerment that I've ever come across, even recently. I was with some some people deep in that lifestyle recently, and it's incredible the amount of
Hmm.
alive the amount of empowerment and aliveness that these people experience. And something so cool about pickup is you get to see if it works. Like
Yeah.
it's not just like theoretical about like, oh, am I like developing or is this whatever? It's like the way that you are showing up and completely uncurated and chaotic. So, I mean, completely uncurated is obviously not the case. There's social norms and agreements playing everywhere, but the the outcomes of entering into an uncurated social environment are just the objective outcomes. It's not anything else. If you do a lot of cold approach, uh, and if you do it well, certain things will happen, and if you don't, other things will happen. And there is some sort of like objective metric in terms of um, what sort of opportunities and connections are available, and not even in the domain of like I want to fuck that girl in the next couple hours as quickly as possible or whatever, but just simply in the domain of establishing connections and rapport and trust and safety and be able to create opportunities that didn't exist previously in environments where usually there's not a lot of meaningful things happening at all.
Hmm.
Even can say a more kind of unusual or high level social environment, such as a contact improvisation festival, there's still a lot of chickens running around, as you say. And I've been there a lot, and I know how challenging it can be to want to be authentic and be seen and to connect with people and to uh, pursue sexual attraction or other kinds of attraction, and to be able to do that well or not is something that I have certainly had my fair share of challenge and suffering and confusion and frustration, just trying to be like, okay, there's so little meaningful experience available for me here if I just kind of behave in a certain like known comfortable way.
Mhm.
And there's so much opportunity for things that I would really enjoy, whether it's like playful connections with people, meaningful conversations, building relationships, building professional connections, meeting new sexual partners, that all of that is available in a social arena. And in many, many cases, that's really not what ends up happening for people, especially in environments that are more chaotic. And I think it makes sense why people are drawn to transformational festivals and authentic relating and all this kind of stuff, because it's like, okay, the social environment is dictating the sense of meaning that I'm experiencing. And I think it's really
Yes.
cool facilitators and producers to be conscientious of like what are the features of this environment that make it easy or not easy for people to experience meaning.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's something on the premise of just like self-leadership, self-responsibility that I think that the pickup artists have worked out a lot more than most people, of just like it's on me. Like I can create that literally anywhere, anywhere, from like a super chaotic nightclub, which is one of my least favorite kind of social environments ever, to, on a busy sidewalk in New York City, which I just, I live a couple miles from New York here, and there's millions of people everywhere, and there's so many opportunities for meaningful moments and beautiful connections and new connections, and almost everybody just doesn't take advantage of those opportunities or pretends they don't exist, or is just in kind of like mind fuck about what is or isn't possible, or who that other person is, or who they are, and just all this stuff that really can intensely get in the way of opportunities that we might really enjoy. So um, yeah, tangent here. I was attempting to go on a weave and bring it back in, but now I don't remember where we started exactly. So there's
That's fine. I like this thread, and I'll tie it into entrepreneurship, um, the way that I see it. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of really good pickup artists end up becoming like business coaches and stuff like that, because
marketer.
there's so many parallels there, um, on this level of what do I believe is possible or not, and how does that affect an interaction that I have. Um, just to give an example, and just for context, I was also exploring the pickup world, and I resonate with quite a lot of the things that you shared, where it's like, holy shit, the level of self-empowerment that comes from that can also be really overwhelming, because you can see how many limitations are actually just my own. It's powerful and it can be overwhelming. And um, I think I've taken a lot of like giving less fucks in interactions, and in me showing up in different spaces and being less,
Mhm.
like, this paradox of being less outcome dependent, which leads potentially to like more possibilities opening up, because I'm entering with a different kind of quality, like less contracted and more receptive to what is possible. And
Yeah.
I've had an experience some months ago where I added someone on Facebook, um, who I resonated with, and like less than a week later, they became a one-on-one coaching client of mine. Um, which just was a cool experience to see like how quickly that can happen. And I wasn't in that interaction as like, fuck, I have to make it happen. But I was also not in this place of like, oh, I'm sure this person needs this or that. I was just present in the interaction, um, and following the energy and trusting that whatever I'm bringing in uh,
Yeah.
is valuable. And if not, then I will get feedback that, and then I can still redirect. But I don't have to like sort of preemptively like hold back certain things, because I have ideas of how that interaction should and shouldn't go. And I think that's something that, yeah, where pickup is a really powerful experience, where like you approach someone on the street who you've never met before, and a couple of minutes later, there is actually an established connection there. Like it's crazy to
Yeah,
experience.
for sure. For sure. Yeah. And it is one of those things where like once you do it enough and you have those imprints and those experiences that it can really be like reality shaping of
Yeah.
just like the difference between like what it's like to know that and have those imprints and having witnessed other people do that and have those experiences yourself and not is a significantly different world to be like all these kind of ideas that I have of like what is or isn't possible in the realms of different kinds of social connections is largely just made up and doesn't exist anywhere but in my head and maybe in the kind of subconscious collusion that people are participating in.
Yes.
You want to highlight one thing that is super interesting here is I get why a lot of people arrive at viewing what you just said as like narcissism or toxic masculinity or something like that, that there is a way of interpreting this language of like, oh, I care less about other people.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that there's a tricky thing here for me, and I think from my experience for a lot of people, a lot of men, people in general, where this notion of being more empowered almost sounds like this notion of being less caring and less
Hmm.
attuned.
Hmm.
I think this is kind of like a complex or nuanced part of masculine integration and
Yeah.
maturity is like knowing when penetration, knowing when certain kinds of like disregard or at least uh, not indulging, I could say, are appropriate and worthwhile, and when is that actually causing harm, or when is it maybe could be more precise here. Like, when am I not being attuned and not receiving feedback for the sake of
Yeah.
my own kind of selfish initiative or
Yes.
intention? And when am I actually just like, fuck that? Like, I don't really care about that. That's not important to me. I like, this is my domain and my expression and my move, and I'm taking it. And even it's okay if you don't like it. That's fine.
Yeah.
It's a fine line between like when is somebody actually just being kind of brash and belligerent and kind of moving through the world like a wrecking ball.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. I don't think there's necessarily a simple solution for that. And I do get why when a lot of men kind of flip that switch or like swallow that pill, that there can be some times of rubbing up against people. And there are many layers, just from being more like uh outgoing or creatively engaged in certain social arenas. There's certainly less safety and like greater likelihood of potentially being judged or causing upset or people not liking you or something like that. And I think there is part of that where we can explore how to be more attuned and have greater integrity and that sort of thing. And then there's
Hmm.
a point where I think that's actually just a kind of manipulation where it is almost like a hungry ghost, that there is no way to be
Yeah.
attuned or conscious enough to be able to be fully empowered in the masculine without upsetting people, that that's literally not a thing. And I think
Yes.
it can be really helpful for people to realize that like there is no way to do that. And sometimes even if there were, it's more important to do the thing than to do the thing precisely. And
Yeah.
yeah, this is so obvious if you like, coach somebody to do cold approach, that the mind fuck that comes up is very often just the same kind of mind fuck that everybody experiences when they learn cold approach, is like the same kind of stuff of like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah. And I think the two things on that, I think one is when it comes to established relationships, where that obviously can also occur, like how much do I hold back out of fear that this might, and so on. And so what feels empowering to me, and I guess it's worked well enough for me, is to be dedicated to repair if potentially something happens, rather than being like, and I think also like for my I my default is definitely like holding back. So I think for me it's a helpful frame or reminder to have that this has worked for me is if I'm dedicated to repair, then I can take more risks, especially in relationships where that's a shared commitment. Like we want to show each other, we want to express ourselves. Also in places where potentially this can cause a damage because we're both dedicated to repairing again.
Mhm.
And the other thing I want to say is this, what you've just been talking about, I think comes up so much for entrepreneurs when it comes to showing up online. Like, oh, I don't want to upset someone. Oh, like I want to be all inclusive in how I communicate things or how I create my offers. And there's a flip side to that where people just like, let me be as polarizing as possible and like let me cause a lot of upset, which I don't know, like really doesn't resonate with me. Like I'm not interested in creating polarizing stuff just for the sake of it. But I think it is healthy um to be able to do that, like to be capable of that and in the right places to do it. Like if you've never done it, you don't even know whether you're doing it for the like greater good or something, or whether you're just hiding.
Mm. It's rich, rich topics here, David, for sure. Brings up stuff around codependency very generally. I could say that, like, thematically, codependency is one way of framing what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And, it can be really tricky in relationship to need a sense of repair, or for the other parties involved to not be upset about something, that can also be kind of a trap when,
Mm,
if we think about codependency as like how do I organize my life in a way so I don't have to feel things? And how do I relate with people where we all are subconsciously kind of agreeing to behave in ways so that we don't have to experience, like, feel things and confront things within us? That's what's happening, within our own individual ecosystems, systems of consciousness and embodiment and whatever, and with human relations and with larger arenas like business and just kind of the commons at large, that there's so much of that kind of collusion that occurred.
mm,
I like Gay and Katie's framing of like upper limiting. Gay and Katie Hendricks are two people that have been really influential. They're incredible,
mhm,
incredible, super influential in my life. But yeah, anyways, Gay talks a lot about upper limiting as in part being this kind of collective collusion that we don't want to outshine one another. We don't want to be too big, because then that would make somebody else feel uncomfortable because they are afraid of their own bigness or whatever. That's a very common part of the usually unconscious influences. And
mm,
maybe this is a segue to kind of talking about what I had in mind of how sexuality relates to business, is the specific thing of like, how do we um have an experience of who we really are, is one way that I could frame it. Like, how do we access expressions of self or expressions of consciousness that are of essence or of soul or whatever we want to call it. Um, and on a practical level, how that stuff seems to correlate with deeper intimacy and connection and deeper pleasure and access to different
mm,
kinds of orgasmic affect and function in the body,
mm,
in the circuit between bodies. Um, and this is a big thing, I think that the reality, as I track it in the domains of sex, and certainly broadly, I think people's thoughts and emotions and beliefs and the stuff that they're running, like the programming or adaptations that they're identified with and familiar with and habituated to, are not necessarily something that they resonate with and will result in them having an awesome life. And it can be confusing because that's the water that we swim in, and it seems like that's me, like that's my personality. And
Yeah.
I think there's also a tremendous amount of, um, I don't know, to use a judgy word, noise in the personal development kind of self-help arenas. E- Yeah, that I think is actually encouraging further identification with certain kinds of like mind activity and persona and this concept of psyche and all this other stuff that it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this is me, like these are my parts, like they're, and
Mm.
that stuff can be how like, I'm not trying to like trash parts work or anything like that. Like that stuff is cool. Plays. But I have seen that it can almost reinforce identification with expressions of consciousness that are not necessarily uh, it's just not necessarily the most constructive mode of self-inquiry and personal exploration and investigation and exploration and traversing of consciousness and how the body works and how this relates to sex and energy exchange and orgasm and all of that, that from what I've seen and what I have gotten feedback around being reliable for lots of different people with different backgrounds is that there are ways to exit that whole game. That
Mm.
like one way that we can say is that like a lot of what people are experiencing is just a adaptation related to a dysregulated biological system.
Mm.
And it doesn't have anything to do with you at all. And it doesn't mean anything. And it's not worth investigating. And there's literally nothing of value to it at all. Like literally at all. It doesn't mean anything at all. It is just something that is arising because you're in a dysregulated biological system. This mammal body is experiencing something like fear, and an adaptation kind of has us go into all of this.
And you mean like the content it produces doesn't have meaning because the pattern itself for me has meaning. Like there's a beauty and a power in it. And for me, it's empowering to acknowledge that like it's a it's a smart thing that it's doing it though.
For sure. I think that the reality of like what people's overthinking is, I think this is interesting. Something that I heard from Katie Hendricks that tracks from my experience is a lot of the mind stuff that people are habituated towards is a fear response where we are basically in flight.
Mm.
And flight is uh, get away to somewhere where there's safety.
Yeah.
And get away to somewhere where there's safety is go up into your head. That we didn't really learn that it's safe to be in a body.
Yeah.
And so much of our experience and orientation and adaptation is away from it. It's like it's either conditional or not existent at all. Like it's not safe to be in a body at all. And I think this kind of gets really wrapped up in a lot of Christian indoctrination too, and plays into, unworthiness stuff related to developmental neglect, developmental trauma. Um, yeah, but to kind of weave it back here, to circle back, I think that there's something right under our nose that I could say is in the realm of somatic mysticism or sexual mysticism, where there is an opportunity, and potentially it's the only way to, or the relatively only way. I said that wrong, but you get what I mean. Relatively speaking, it's the only way to access these kinds of experiences where there's so much more beauty in connection and embodiment and
Mm.
experience, is to learn how to not get involved in all of this noise that
Mm.
is occurring on this plane. And it's very difficult sometimes for people to grok this because they are not aware that that's what it is, because it is more or less the entirety of their experience.
Yeah, I mean you need some level of being able to observe this to even have a like fathom the possibility that there's something beyond it. So if I'm like in it, it's
Yeah, it
hard.
just seems like me. It just seems like, oh,
Yeah.
these are my thoughts. Like this is my this is my reality, basically.
Yeah. And then there is a very disembodied way of like disconnecting from these patterns.
Totally. So yeah, this is a really important point. So I have a background, I was trained in a coaching model that's very like ontologically oriented. So are you. That same model, same school, where the premise is basically like anything that arises, it's just like, thank you for sharing and redirect your attention on your best articulations of your values and goals, basically. And that I don't feel satisfied by that. Like I think it's useful. It's a useful model for orienting to life and even coaching in some contexts, but I find it to be highly incomplete. And
Mm,
the trauma healing somatics people get a lot of things right too. And I've also seen that there's a tremendous amount of indulgence and what I would describe as like immature femininity in those communities, regardless of gender or anything like that. That it seems like there's a tendency towards indulgence and like uh it's like a lot of wealthy people from the US and Europe
mm,
seem to get really, really involved in their stories and their patterns, and
mm,
they're so in their stuff that there's um,
mm,
usually like less creativity, less service, less enjoyment of life because people are like playing in their own shit instead of just letting it go and focusing on something that's more life-giving and expansive. And I think it does take a lot of skill
yeah.
to learn the difference between am I just indulging in something that does not matter and isn't useful to investigate further, or is this really important for me to meet or release or to inquire into and get something out of? And I find that this kind of integration of the masculine and feminine is really, really, really important
Yeah.
in the moment, but certainly when we zoom out and look at like relationship harmony and like a sexual life rather than like a sexual experience or something.
Mm,
So, yeah, to bring it back around, I do think that the awareness of like how do I get out of, to use our homegirl's language, Elon says the matrix of our sexual culture, and I think that that's she says something like that, and I think it's on point. Like, how do we get out of this context where there's only certain kinds of thoughts, emotions, experiences, um, geometries and textures and pathways and expressions of consciousness um, to other contexts that are potentially more dynamic and expansive and beneficial for people or for people in a transpersonal and collective and interpersonal way too.
yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that I figured out in those domains, just kind of coming from my own kind of neuroses and pathologies and challenges to supporting a lot of people in similar intentions of like how do you do that? How do you get out of that? Because I think when we don't know how to get out of that, what we're left with is optimizing this very like 3D sexual culture context, which ends up being a conversation about like kind of pornographic type developments, like how do you do these different techniques? Like how do you, it's like very basic, like
Mm.
how do I become like a porn star level lover or something is like the
You can check like the Tim Ferriss, the 4 Hour Body for an example of that.
yeah, like it's cutting edge for a lot of people in those podcasts, and there's countless YouTube videos and stuff of like, and there's some stuff in there that I think is useful, like I think it's generally good to know about anatomy. I think especially for anatomy of a kind of body that you don't have. I think it's very useful to yeah, and there's some resources in that. I know that the consent conversation is cool. I think that people have really taken it to a pretty hardcore extent of like they think it's like the holy grail of sexual awakening or something is like consent conversations or whatever. And yeah, I mean that's a whole can of worms. I think consent is important. I think of course be I think it's imperative to make sure that everybody is on the same page and being respectful and considerate of people's sovereignty and all that stuff. So don't get me wrong there. I'm not, don't come after me. But yeah, I do think that there's so much more that I'm interested in and that
Mm,
seems to have greater impact on people's sexual lives is when we're having a conversation that's really about embodied consciousness, uh, somatic mysticism as the way into having sexual experiences that are just of a completely different paradigm and category of meaning and fulfillment and um, depth, could say.
mm, beautiful. Mm. I like this frame of, and maybe that's a good transition to you talking briefly about like ways that people can right now engage with your work, just aware of the time. And
Hmm.
it's good to come to an end slowly. But I like this frame of I help you get out of the current matrix of sexual experiences that you think is possible. Like it's a cool frame. It creates a lot of intrigue and it creates a sense of like, yeah, I think deep down we're not interested in optimizing the sex we currently have. Like I know I've been called to explore sexuality because I felt that it's one of the or the most powerful portal to experiences that are way beyond what I can currently grasp.
Mhm.
And that's been my drive. And
Yeah,
yeah, you want to share a bit of um, your upcoming offer or ways that people can engage with you?
sure. Yeah. I feel like we're just getting warmed up here and just finding the different threads that we could play around in. I do like to, when introducing these kinds of concepts and topics, to offer some kind of practical stuff that
Mm,
literally do now or soon. But maybe we'll just leave a little cliffhanger there for people to tune into a future episode between us or to
mm,
find somewhere on the worlds of the internet or whatever. Um, yeah, so all the branding related stuff around the work is in flux and not necessarily going to be what it is in the future, but I think this domain will at least be hyperlinked. If you go to uh
curious which one you'll say now.
Yeah, right. I hate not having great sex all the time.com is where you can find some information. That's a cheeky URL that will direct you to some information about the upcoming programs that I'm running. I will be doing something soon, and then another round in January, and likely on a semi-regular basis there from there forwards. And I try to accommodate for people who are in Europe as well as in the US and have normal kind of 9 to 5 jobs, as well as folks who maybe prefer morning sessions or midday or something like that too. So, yeah, I hate not having great sex all the time.com. My name is Rob Kancler, Kancler. If you look me up on the various socials, you won't find very much besides a way of getting in touch with me. But soon there will be a more kind of public facing or accessible library of content, or at least access to where you can find it.
Great. I
Cool,
hate
David.
not having great sex all the time.com. Yeah, we'll put it somewhere around this video so you can check it out.
Yeah, right? Because it's like, who doesn't? David, thank you. Thank you for this time. It's nice to reconnect with you. And
Mm,
yeah, I feel like we could go for 3 or 4 hours here and collect the various open threads that we just touched on in the past bit
yeah,
and certainly
yeah,
find more and elaborate.
yeah, yeah. I think we'll do a follow-up at some point. And yeah, thank you for your generosity of time and sharing and um, your your passion for this body of work can really
Thank,
come across.
Thank you. In a way, it feels like it chose me, or it would be like abject or perverse for me to not be in this exploration and entrepreneurial journey around this particular subject. Like
Mhm,
I don't think I could not.
mhm.
Well, cool, David. Thanks
All
again,
right.
brother.
Thank you.